Welcome to Ancestors. I'm your host, Scott Wilkinson. Today, we'll explore immigration records, the ship's passenger lists and shipping indexes, as well as naturalization and citizenship papers. These records not only help you trace the origins of your ancestors, they can reveal many details of their experience in moving to a new land.
Immigration records, records of the passenger arrivals and the naturalizations are particularly important and lots of fun for Americans because this is the immigrant story. This is the major dramatic chapter in an American family tree when the family gives up citizenship of one country and moves over to another country.
Kathy Horn of New York City was searching for the immigration records of her great-aunt, a woman with 3 children who had come through Ellis Island in the early 1900s.
When I think about what some of my ancestors did coming to a foreign country, just sometimes the mother with the children coming alone, knowing that her husband's already here, the idea of going to a foreign country by sea, not knowing the language, not knowing what you're going to find, trying to envision it seems mind-boggling. I knew that my great-aunt Catherine Spiegel arrived in 1910, and that she had 3 daughters, so I knew that I had to get back to that passenger arrival record for 1910.
Ships from all over the world, filled with immigrants, sailed here into New York Harbor, headed for Ellis Island. And the records of their travels from their homeland to this new world were ships' passenger lists. Now, these records can reveal things about your ancestors that you can't find in any other source. Things like how much money they arrived with, could they read or write, what was their vocation, and who were they traveling with? And was there someone waiting to welcome them here in America?
When we talk about immigration and records pertaining to the immigrant story, researching the immigrant ancestor, the 2 basic, most important records that Americans seek are the passenger arrival record, sometimes called the ship passenger list, and the naturalization record. You may find one or the other, you may find both if you're lucky. But these are the 2 most important records that really give you the immigrant ancestor's story of coming to America. Passenger records from 1820 to about 1891 are called customs passenger lists because they were kept by the U.S. Customs Bureau. For every man, woman, and child on the ship, you have the name of the passenger, age, sex, occupation or calling, and country of origin. Not the specific town, but the country.
It's one lament of genealogists that they don't tell you what part of the country they came from. In the 455 ships that sailed from Liverpool to New York in 1851, only 13 contained that detail, and there was no column for it in the passenger list. But it happened to be filled in by the captain for some reason best known to himself.
Sometimes the ship captain will note births that took place, will give the name of the child and the mother who delivered the child on the date, the exact date. So that's as good as a vital record.
Beginning in the 1890s, you will also find marital status, whether ever in the United States of America before, if so, when, where, and for how long, who paid the passage overseas, and if you could read and write. That was another requirement. The government said we should have immigrants should be able to read and write. So, of course, word spread from village to village, shtetl to shtetl, tell them you can read and write. So when they, can you read and write? Yes, I can read and write, yes, yes. So we have only literate people coming over. Everybody can read and write on the ship passenger list, but then they have trouble signing their names. From 1820 on into the 1950s, we have passenger arrival records that name everybody on every ship coming into U.S. ports, to the extent that they've been preserved over the years. The way to find one passenger among the millions, since they cover all of the ports and they go from 1820 into the 1950s, unless you know the name of the ship and the exact date of arrival, you simply couldn't go access the ship passenger list and find your ancestor.
It's been a case of sitting down in 1898 and reading through ship by ship. And I'm not very far along, but it's a horrible way to do it, but trying to find them going day by day and ship by ship through the year I know he arrived.
Fortunately, we have major indexes covering lots of years for the various ports that were in use in this country. These are on microfilm. They're available through the National Archives or through the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, and in many major public libraries as well. The major index to passenger arrivals in North America from the 1600s up into the early 20th century is P. William Philby's Passenger and Immigration List Index. It's a huge multi-volume set, but it is an index to published arrival information. His team of readers read through local histories, county histories, colonial histories, and wherever they come across the name of an immigrant with some immigrant information, they extract that name from the published source and put it into the next volume of the big index.
There is some specific information that you absolutely must have before you try to tackle a passenger list. You've got to have an approximate date of arrival. You've got to have an approximate age of the immigrant. You've got to have some idea of what country they were coming from. You'd also do well to know where they settled once they came to the United States.
From the federal census, I learned the year of arrival in this country, and also the age of the individual in 1920. So now, knowing how long they had been in the country, I could then sort of step back as to what their age would have been in the year of arrival. I then went to the index to narrow down the actual reel of film for 1910 that I would find her on, and then with the information from the index, I could then go to the actual ship's passenger arrival record and look at the original manuscript or the microfilm of the manuscript and determine whether or not this was the family I was searching for. And I found the record and noticed that there was a reference next to her name about in hospital and discharged. So I checked the last page of the ship's passenger arrival records, the detainee listing, those people who were detained on Ellis for a variety of reasons, and found that her daughters, Margaret and Margaret's two sisters, were detained for several days on Ellis Island.
When it opened in 1892, hundreds of thousands of immigrants from every part of the world poured into Ellis Island, hoping to be accepted into their new country.
Ellis Island was the principal immigration station during the peak immigration years, and approximately 90% of all immigrants to America came through Ellis Island, with the remainder of the other 30 immigration stations accounting for about 10%. So Ellis Island really represents the immigrant heritage of America.
While immigration records give us glimpses into the journeys our ancestors made to America, New York's Lower East Side Tenement Museum preserves the conditions that many of them lived in once they left Ellis Island.
Well, what we've tried to do with each one of our apartments is tell a story. Tell the story of a family that lived at 97 Orchard Street. And I hope that when a visitor comes to the museum and learns about Natalie Gumpertz, she's a single mother. The Balditzis, they had come as illegal immigrants, or the Rogaszewskis, who were sitting Shiva mourning the death of Abraham Rogaszewski. Then I think the Tenement Museum really has done its job in trying to promote historical perspective.
Places like the Tenement Museum can help us understand how our immigrant ancestors may have lived once they arrived in the United States. Knowing where they came from and what they endured helps us connect with them. And if the living conditions seemed difficult once they arrived in the United States, they were probably used to them after their long journey across the ocean. And for many of them, that journey began right here at the Albert Dock in Liverpool, England. These docks are famous for the vast number of immigrants that traveled through here. And there were many other major departure points as well. Kathy Horn's ancestors, for example, departed from the city of Fiume on the west coast of present-day Bosnia. Others traveled from such ports as Hamburg, Germany, and Stockholm, Sweden. Although they departed from many different ports, the journey on board the large ships was pretty much the same. And here at the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool, England, visitors can get a first-hand look at the miserable conditions that their ancestors would have probably endured. Most immigrants would have traveled in the steerage area of the ship, the below-deck accommodations for poor travelers. Here's where they had to deal with cramped living quarters, disease, seasickness, as well as a host of other conditions.
During time of a storm, when they were unable to get on deck, when the one hatch, as it sometimes was battened down, you can just imagine what it was like. Hygiene just went to the winds. There were inadequate toilet provision, possibly one toilet per 100, and there were some really unsavory cases of people just operating in their bunks, you might say, and stuff dripping through to the bunk below.
What a terrible, horrible, hard times they must persevere to build a whole new life, a new family here in a new world.
You can't help but come out with a new appreciation of what our ancestors went through and how what they went through has changed our lives.
What if your ancestors came from Asia or South America or some other part of the world? This globe on display here at Ellis Island shows the more commonly used immigration routes from points all over the world. And depending on the year your ancestors traveled, some of these routes were used more than others. And understanding the routes that they traveled could help you find the port from which they might have left. For those whose ancestors departed from the United Kingdom or even passed through on their way to America, the Public Record Office here in London may have documentation about that departure from a British port.
These were the official records of everyone embarking or disembarking at a British port on a British ship. But they only cover ships that were crossing oceans. They don't cover smaller ships like ferries crossing the North Sea. So if you take an example of a family emigrating from the Ukraine, crossing Europe, getting on a ferry somewhere in Europe, and crossing to the UK to embark, say, at Liverpool to go to New York, there would be no record of them entering the UK, but there would be a record of them embarking at Liverpool. All the records that we hold relating to immigration have been filmed and therefore are available in the States, in the family history centres there.
In looking at ships' records and passenger lists, you need to go over the information very carefully to make sure you don't miss something important.
I was looking over them, excited I'd found it and curious as to what story they held. I must have looked over this particular list several dozen times and finally noticed that there was another name, which I had never heard, didn't know about. According to the record, there was a fourth daughter, Apollonia Spiegel. I had never heard of another daughter. I knew of the three daughters growing up, but didn't know about a fourth. And at that point, it had been 83 years after they had arrived in this country. So Apollonia had been pretty much forgotten for most of that time, at least by everyone perhaps but her own mother. And that began my search for Apollonia. According to the list, I could see the notes that the child was in hospital and it said discharged, but then it also looked like somebody had handwritten in a date with the word died. It made me more curious. There was a story here that there was more involved in coming in. It wasn't just arriving, getting cleared through and moving on.
Ships' passenger lists are another area on the internet where volunteers are doing some terrific work. There's a lot of transcribed ship's passenger lists that people are putting up. Somebody maybe has done a little research on a specific ship that their ancestor came over and they happen to make a copy of that list, and then they're transcribing it or extracting information from that list and putting it online to share with others. One example of this is the Immigrant Ships Transcribers Guild. It's just a group of volunteers that go and do this exact thing and are trying to make ships lists available to everyone.
A passenger list is a fascinating document to look at. It can be misleading, but it can be very, very informative. In any kind of an index or in any kind of a record, we have to realize that there are errors, human errors. As long as humans are keeping records, there are going to be errors.
One common error in immigration records is spelling. If the immigrant were Hungarian and the clerk were Greek, the immigrant's name could be completely changed.
My maiden name was Nowitzki. Now that sounds simple, N-O-V-I-T-S-K-I, which is a phonetic spelling. No, 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 my father would have a fit. It's N-O-W-Y-C-K-Y-J. I think I have found about 3 or 4 others here in the US. But who would ever spell it that way? My great-grandmother also has descendants here. Chustchustchen. How would you spell it? Well, if you're a nice American from Boston, Irish Catholic background, you can put an O in front of it. But it was spelled Jasczczyn. The only reason I can spell it was I could never pronounce it.
Not everyone would speak English, and so you would have to deal with how a name would sound and then try to spell it that way, as opposed to someone telling you exactly how it was spelled. And the accents would make a difference in how that name was coming across.
If you don't speak the language of the country your ancestor came from, contact somebody who does, because they can help you through some of these changes. Possibly translations of names, possibly phonetic pronunciations, and what the spelling should be or should have been.
When I first looked at the record and saw that Catherine was in hospital and the 3 children were detained, it showed that they were detained by themselves, Margaret and her 2 younger sisters. Margaret, the oldest, being about 11 years old, and now she has 2 smaller sisters to take care of, and she's separated from her mother. My thoughts were, that must be absolutely frightening for 3 small children to be in a foreign country where they have a language barrier, separated from their mother, and according to the detainee list, they were there for several days. While they don't give the exact dates, when you look at the detainee listing, it lists the number of breakfasts, the number of lunches, and the number of dinners that they had. So from that, you can calculate about how many days they were there. The mother, my great aunt, was told the baby had died. So she picked up her 3 daughters and continued on to live in Pennsylvania. Part of the heartbreak of not only losing your 15-month-old baby, excuse me, but I think it must be equally heartbreaking to realize that you don't even know where the baby is buried. I wanted to find Apollonia's death certificate because on the death certificate it would identify the cemetery where she was buried. One day I was down at the municipal archives when one of the clerks suggested that I might want to check Richmond County. He had heard someone say that some deaths at Ellis Island were often filed under Richmond County. And I looked into them, and in the index I did find Apollonia Spiegel. When I got the death certificate then, it showed that she had died at the Hospital for Contagious Diseases on Hoffman Island. And it showed that Apollonia was very ill with a number of illnesses, any one of which would be highly contagious. So that's where she spent her last few days. When I made the copy, I noticed that the cemetery said Mount Oliver. I had the suspicion that it might be Mount Olivet, so I then wrote to the cemetery saying that I suspected that she was there, and if she was, could they confirm this for me? And I received a letter back confirming that she was there, and very kindly suggested that if I was going to make it on a weekend, let them know, and they could possibly have somebody take me out there to the area, that it was not a well-traveled area of their cemetery. Babies are not supposed to die. And when they do unexpectedly, that's one thing. But when you've almost reached your goal, they were here at our doorstep. And Apollonia was so ill, and she died here.
If you can't seem to get anywhere through immigration records, turn to naturalization records. They could be the breakthrough you've been looking for.
So when we talk about naturalization records, we're really talking about 2 different pieces of paper. The ancestor's declaration of intention, and then the ancestor's petition for naturalization, sometimes called the first papers and second papers or final papers. Now, when it comes to naturalization research, you check the county courthouse first. If you don't find a record there, you check the federal courts. In our regional archive system, if you don't find the record there, you check the municipal court of a city near where your ancestor lived. Municipal courts naturalized millions of people. So always remember, if your ancestor lived in a major city, he might have simply gone to the city court. And these records today are in the city hall or the city archives.
individuals could be naturalized in any court of record until 1906. At that time, the Immigration and Naturalization Service came into being. So for the first time, every court had to use this standard form, and anyone who has an ancestor who came in after 1906 and was naturalized after that date is in for a treat, because it's loaded with biographical information.
If your ancestor was naturalized since September 27, 1906, your research is going to be greatly simplified by sending a letter to the Immigration Naturalization Service, provide the name of the immigrant ancestor, his place of residence, the time frame when you think he was naturalized, and they'll search their records and let you know if they have any naturalization record. If you're having trouble finding a ship passenger list, getting the information about the arrival of that immigrant from the naturalization records might be very helpful, because many naturalization records will give you the name of the port and the date of arrival, and sometimes even the name of the ship.
We found the naturalization papers that my other grandfather had filled out, and having that information gave me his date of arrival and his ship, and so I was able then to go back to the passenger ship lists and find him immediately because that information was there.
The truth is that you may not come up with a record. Many of our immigrant ancestors did not complete the process. They didn't find it necessary for their day-to-day lives. The children became American citizens by being born here, and they voted, they held and transferred property, they held public office, the rights and privileges of citizenship. Also important to remember is those classes of aliens whose citizenship was derived from the head of the household. When the father got his papers, the wife and the minor children were automatically naturalized under his paperwork.
So many people are naturally fascinated with the idea of Americana. You know, we want to know where it was that our ancestors first stepped foot on American soil. I mean, that gets us, you know, excited about the American experience.
Immigration records are often the best connection between the land your ancestors settled and the land they left behind. Tracing someone to their homeland builds a bridge between you and your past. And that's what it's all about, discovering your family and connecting with your ancestors.
I'm just glad that I was able to locate Apollonia and to find out where she is today and, in a sense, restore her to the family. So it's been very gratifying to me to find out where she is and know where she is. And as a result, that was one of the things that prompted me to put her name on the wall at Ellis Island. And it was my way of making sure that her name was never forgotten again. In a sense, she's finally made it to Ellis Island, and she's made it through the gates there.
Next time on Ancestors.
My grandfather, my grandmother, and my father all died within a very short time of each other. And I felt a great loss. It planted within me a desire to get to know them, because suddenly they're gone.
For Taylor MacDonald, this desire led him to write a family history as a way of sharing his incredible stories that he was learning of his grandparents and their surprising friendship with the notorious outlaw, Pancho Villa.